In 1896, a German archaeological team digging through the ruins of ancient Nippur found a broken clay tablet buried under the floor of a collapsed temple archive. At the time, nobody thought the discovery was especially important. Mesopotamia had already produced thousands of inscriptions, and most of them followed familiar patterns. They recorded taxes, trade deals, inventories, royal orders, or religious ceremonies. This fragment seemed headed for the same fate as countless others. It was catalogued, stored, and mostly forgotten. Years later, when scholars finally studied the surviving lines more closely, they found something unexpected. The text was not describing a king. It was not describing a war. It was not retelling a creation myth or a great flood. Instead, the unknown scribe seemed focused on one subject: death. More exactly, what happens in the moments right after it. That alone would not have been remarkable. Ancient cultures everywhere developed beliefs about the afterlife. What made this tablet different was the way those beliefs were presented. The language was strangely exact. Instead of speaking in symbols or poetic images, the text unfolded as a series of observations, almost as if someone were recording a process step by step. Conditions were recorded, stages appeared in a fixed order. Certain experiences seemed expected rather than imagined. Then researchers reached a damaged section near the center of the inscription. Although part of the text had been lost, enough survived to suggest something deeply unusual. According to the most widely accepted reconstruction, the first encounter after death is not described as a judgment. It is not described as a reward. It is not described as a punishment. Instead, it is described as a choice. The tablet never explains who created that choice. It never explains why it exists. Far more attention is given to something else. What happens to those who refuse? And that is where the surviving lines become hard to ignore, because several descriptions preserved on this ancient fragment seem strikingly similar to accounts reported thousands of years later by people who briefly died and somehow returned. Whether that similarity is a coincidence, a misunderstanding, or evidence of something far stranger is impossible to know. What is certain is that the scribe who carved these words into clay believed the choice was real, believed its consequences mattered, and believed future generations would one day need to hear the warning he left behind. If stories like this interest you, consider subscribing, because the choice described on this tablet is only one part of a much larger system, and the deeper we follow the inscription, the stranger that system becomes. The warning left by the scribe makes little sense until we look more closely at the world from which the tablet came. By the time this inscription was carved into clay, Mesopotamian civilization had already existed for thousands of years. Cities rose and fell along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates. Dynasties came and went. Trade routes stretched across huge distances. Yet through all those centuries, one question stayed remarkably strong. What happens after death? The surviving records do not offer one single answer. Some texts describe a shadowy realm beneath the earth where the dead exist as pale reflections of their former selves. Others speak of divine courts, supernatural journeys, and powerful beings who rule the boundary between life and death. Priests, scribes, and rulers all left pieces of a much larger picture, but those pieces rarely fit together neatly. That is one reason the Nippur tablet stands apart. Instead of presenting a myth, the inscription seems to assume the reader already understands the basic framework. The scribe does not stop to explain the journey. He does not try to persuade anyone that the process is real. Instead, he writes as if he is recording something already known within a small circle of initiates. Several damaged passages suggest the tablet was never meant for public audiences. Names appear without introduction. Concepts are mentioned without definition. Entire stages are referred to as if the reader has seen them before. The writing feels less like instruction and more like a reminder. A surviving section near the beginning of the text gives one of the strongest clues. Before describing the choice hinted at in the earlier passage, the scribe introduces a term that appears nowhere in the major public inscriptions of the period. The word itself is hard to translate exactly, but most researchers agree it refers to a condition rather than a location. That difference matters. The tablet does not first describe a destination waiting for the dead. It describes a state of awareness, a threshold, something met before the journey truly begins. According to the surviving lines, the traveler does not immediately enter another world after death. Instead, a period of transition happens first. The text treats this stage as expected, almost ordinary, as if every consciousness passes through it, no matter its status, wealth, belief, or accomplishments. Kings and laborers, priests and merchants. The difference does not seem to matter. What matters is what happens next. Because once the traveler reaches this threshold, the tablet says a sequence begins to unfold in a fixed order. The first stage leads to the second leads to the third. And according to the scribe, everything that follows depends on recognizing what is happening before the choice is finally presented. That is where the surviving account truly begins. Not with judgment, not with punishment, but with the moment the traveler realizes that the separation has already happened. According to the surviving lines, the journey begins the moment the traveler realizes that death has already happened. Nothing dramatic happens at first. No gates appear. No divine figures come out of the darkness. No judgment is announced. Instead, awareness stays exactly where it was. The world can still be sensed. Familiar surroundings remain visible. Yet something about them feels different. Distance no longer behaves normally. Time becomes hard to measure. Ordinary details remain recognizable, but they seem strangely separate, as if the traveler is watching them from a place that cannot be reached. Below, the body remains where it was left. The traveler understands what has happened. Recognition comes before fear. Acceptance comes before confusion. Several damaged passages suggest this stage lasts only a short time, though the scribe never tries to measure it exactly. What matters is not the length of time, but the experience itself. Consciousness remains intact. Memory remains intact. Identity remains intact. That observation is important because it creates the first major contradiction in the tablet. Most Mesopotamian descriptions of the afterlife are remarkably bleak. The dead are often shown as weakened beings living in a shadowy realm far removed from the life of the living world. In many surviving texts, awareness fades and importance slowly disappears. Nothing in this account matches that picture. Instead of becoming less aware, the traveler seems to become more aware. Instead of moving into darkness, perception becomes clearer. Instead of feeling abandoned, the traveler begins to feel a growing familiarity with what is unfolding. The sequence then enters a second stage. Something approaches. The inscription never identifies it directly. No name is given. No title appears. Only the reaction is recorded. A feeling of recognition begins to appear as if something long forgotten is slowly returning to memory. Uncertainty gives way to calm. Confusion begins to fade. The atmosphere becomes harder and harder to match with traditional Mesopotamian views of death. Then, the account introduces the detail that changes everything. Appearing at the edge of awareness is a radiance the traveler seems to recognize by instinct. Although the original term carries ideas of divine brightness, the experience itself is described in unexpectedly gentle terms. Warmth replaces distance, certainty replaces hesitation, a sense of arrival begins to form. Most importantly, nothing is forced. No command is given, no authority is imposed, no attempt is made to pull the traveler forward. The radiance simply stays where it is, open, patient, waiting. That patience may be the most unusual detail in the whole passage. Religious texts often show divine power through judgment, authority, or intervention. Here, whatever stands at the threshold behaves differently. It waits for recognition before asking for consent. And according to the next section of the tablet, the radiance is not the destination. It is only the entrance because hidden beyond it is the moment around which the whole inscription seems to be built. A single question, one that every traveler is eventually required to answer. Everything described so far seems to lead toward one moment. The separation, the awareness that survives it, the radiance waiting at the threshold. None of these stages seem to exist only for themselves. Each one moves the traveler toward a question. Only after the presence has been recognized does the next stage begin. No surviving line suggests a command. Nothing that looks like judgment appears. Instead, the account describes an invitation delivered through a voice connected to the Radiance itself. Large parts of the inscription have been lost. Yet the central idea remains surprisingly clear. The traveler is not asked whether they deserve what comes next. No question is asked about status, achievement, belief, or failure. What matters is something much simpler, whether they are willing to continue. At first glance, that detail may not seem remarkable. A closer look reveals something more unusual. Throughout the ancient world, death was often imagined as a passage ruled by laws, tests, or authorities. Egyptian funerary texts describe a soul moving through a carefully structured journey. Greek traditions keep stories of ferrymen, judges, and distant realms set aside for different kinds of lives. Similar ideas appear across Persia, Anatolia, and the wider Near East. The details are different. The pattern remains again and again. The dead arrive at a boundary. An encounter takes place. Movement into the next stage depends on something more than physical death alone. That is where the Nippur tablet begins to differ. Instead of focusing on judgment, the inscription focuses on consent. Instead of punishment, it emphasizes participation. The traveler is not pushed forward. The traveler chooses. And according to the surviving line, something important happens before that choice is made. A brief moment of understanding, not understanding in the ordinary sense, more like memory returning all at once. The scribe describes it as a form of recognition that comes before words, before explanation, before the invitation is fully given. For an instant, the traveler seems to understand where the path leads, who waits beyond it, perhaps even why the journey began. That detail becomes harder and harder to ignore because echoes of it appear far beyond Mesopotamia. Accounts separated by geography, language, and centuries often describe an overwhelming sense of knowing that happens before a transition. None of these accounts prove anything, and they should not be treated as evidence of one hidden truth. Even so, the similarities remain striking. The deeper researchers compare such accounts, the more often the same themes appear: recognition, return, invitation, choice. That repetition creates an unsettling possibility. Maybe the tablet was not describing a uniquely Sumerian belief. Maybe it was trying to describe an experience that different cultures later explained through different languages and symbols. Whether that possibility is correct remains impossible to know, and the inscription gives no direct answer. Instead, it adds another layer to the mystery. The traveler is not shown only comfort. Something else is revealed. The surviving lines are badly damaged here, but several phrases suggest that the moment of recognition includes more than a destination. It includes understanding, not just of where the path leads, but of what accepting the invitation really means. The wording becomes frustratingly vague. Even so, the meaning is hard to miss. The traveler seems to glimpse the larger structure behind the process itself, a pattern, a cycle, perhaps even an agreement that existed before life began. That idea may sound unfamiliar, yet versions of it appear again and again in later traditions. Stories of souls choosing lives before birth, returning to a greater source after death, or taking part in a cycle larger than any single lifetime can be found in spiritual systems separated by huge distances and centuries of history. The Nippur tablet never fully explains such ideas. It only hints at them, and that may explain the most important question raised by the whole inscription. If the Radiance offers comfort, why would anyone refuse it? If the invitation feels familiar, what reason could there be to hesitate? The tablet never answers those questions directly. Instead, the account turns its attention to the consequences, because according to the next surviving section, refusal is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of another path entirely. One, the scribe seems far more concerned with recording. If the Radiance feels familiar, the obvious question is why anyone would refuse it. According to the surviving inscription, some travelers do. The tablet never explains how often it happens, no numbers are given, no reasons are listed. What survives is the consequence. Attention turns away from the Radiance. The invitation remains open. Yet the traveler does not move toward it. Instead, awareness begins to drift backward toward memory, toward unfinished concerns, toward the world that has already been left behind. This transition appears only briefly in the surviving lines, but the change in direction is unmistakable. Until this point, every stage has moved toward the threshold. Now the movement reverses. The traveler looks back. That decision becomes the foundation of everything that follows. A damaged section near the center of the inscription may preserve the experience of one single traveler. Complete certainty is impossible. Yet many researchers believe the passage shifts from general description to individual example. If that interpretation is correct, the account becomes noticeably more human. Instead of discussing abstract stages, the scribe begins describing observation. A conversation continues, someone laughs, a door closes, life moves forward exactly as it did before. Nothing looks different to the living, no one notices the presence watching them. No one responds, no one turns. A familiar routine unfolds, exactly as expected. Voices rise and fall. Someone leaves the room. Another person arrives moments later. The ordinary rhythm of life continues without interruption, making the separation feel more real with every passing moment. The distance between observer and world remains invisible. Yet it grows with every passing moment. What makes the passage effective is its simplicity. No monsters appear. No punishment is described. No supernatural force steps in. The suffering comes from something far more ordinary: attachment. The traveler remains focused on what can no longer be reached. According to the surviving lines, this realization comes slowly. At first, there is still hope that something might change. Then comes the understanding that nothing will. The world remains visible. Participation does not. Observation remains possible. Return does not. That difference seems to mark the true beginning of the second path. Meanwhile, the radiance has not disappeared. The invitation has not been withdrawn. Nothing in the inscription suggests rejection. The threshold remains exactly where it was. Yet the stronger the attachment becomes, the farther away the radiance seems. Not because it moves away, but because attention moves somewhere else. That may be the most important detail in the whole sequence. The second path does not begin with punishment. It begins with fixation. And according to the next surviving section of the tablet, that fixation eventually becomes drift. Drift is one of the hardest terms in the whole inscription to translate. The original wording carries several meanings at once: movement without direction, separation without destination, continuation without progress. Whatever the scribe meant, the condition seems deeply different from the path described earlier. The traveler is no longer moving toward the radiance. Neither is the traveler returning to life. Instead, awareness remains fixed between the two. That detail has led some researchers to suggest a symbolic interpretation. Maybe the tablet is describing grief. Maybe it is describing attachment. Maybe the whole sequence was meant as a metaphor for spiritual transformation rather than a literal account of death. Those explanations remain possible, yet they do not fully explain why the inscription spends so much time describing observation. Again and again, the traveler watches. Attention remains fixed on the world that can no longer be reached. Movement becomes harder and harder. Strangely, similar descriptions appear in a very different kind of material. Not ancient mythology, modern testimony. For more than a century, physicians, psychologists, and researchers have collected reports from people who were declared clinically dead before later returning to consciousness. The details vary a great deal, yet certain patterns appear with surprising consistency. Many describe awareness continuing after normal sensory perception should have ended. Others report watching events from a detached point of view. Some speak of overwhelming familiarity. Others describe encounters with light. A smaller group describe confusion, gray spaces, emotional distance, or the feeling of being unable to return. Not every account includes those elements. Many include none of them. Even so, the overlap is hard to ignore. Most scientists do not see such reports as proof of an afterlife. Neurological explanations remain the main view. Changes in brain chemistry may create vivid internal experiences. Lack of oxygen may change perception. Memory reconstruction may shape what survivors later report. The effects of trauma, medication, and anesthesia may also play a part. Those explanations may ultimately prove correct. The Nippur tablet cannot confirm or disprove any of them. What makes the comparison interesting is not the conclusion, it is the pattern. Separated by thousands of years, the ancient inscription and many modern accounts seem concerned with the same group of experiences: awareness, observation, recognition, choice, attachment. Whether those similarities point to shared human psychology or something more remains impossible to determine. The tablet gives no answer. Instead, it keeps describing the consequences of drift. According to the surviving lines, attention slowly becomes a kind of environment. The longer the traveler stays focused on unfinished concerns, the harder movement seems to become. Memory turns inward. Observation narrows. Possibility begins to shrink. The wording suggests neither punishment nor outside control. Everything happens through fixation itself. That idea feels strangely modern. Contemporary psychology often describes attention as a force that shapes experience. Thoughts repeated often enough become patterns. Patterns become habits. Habits influence perception. Perception influences reality as it is experienced by the individual. The tablet seems to apply a similar principle beyond death, not as science, not as proof, but as a disturbing possibility. A consciousness, unable to let go of what has already ended, becomes more and more defined by it. That interpretation may explain why the inscription puts so much emphasis on choice. The decision is not presented as a moral test. It works more like orientation. One path moves forward, the other stays attached to what can no longer be changed. And according to the final surviving sections of the tablet, drift does not continue forever. Eventually, something else arrives, something the traveler cannot ignore, something the scribe seems to regard as the last chance to leave the second path behind. According to the surviving lines, drift does not continue forever. Eventually, something appears. The shift is unmistakable. For the first time since the traveler turned away from the Radiance, attention is drawn towards something beyond memory, beyond attachment, and beyond the world that has already been left behind. Unfortunately, this is also where the inscription becomes hardest to understand. Several key passages are damaged. Entire sections are missing. Important terms survive only as partial reconstructions. Whatever the scribe originally recorded, much of it has been lost to time. That limit matters. Different translators sometimes disagree. Alternative readings exist. In some places, one missing symbol can change the meaning of a whole passage. For that reason, caution is necessary. Ancient texts are hard to interpret, even when they are complete. This one is not. Any reconstruction involves some degree of guesswork. The same caution applies to the comparisons explored throughout this investigation. Parallels with modern experiences are interesting. They are not proof. Similar patterns can appear independently across cultures. Shared experiences do not always mean a shared source. Natural explanations remain possible. Psychological explanations remain possible. Future discoveries could completely change our understanding. Additional fragments could change the interpretation. Yet one fact remains hard to dismiss. The scribe believed this final encounter mattered. As the surviving lines move towards their conclusion, the inscription becomes more and more focused on warning rather than description. That change feels deliberate. And according to the last readable portions of the tablet, what appears after drift is not simply another stage of the journey, it may be the final chance to leave the second path behind. If the surviving inscription is interpreted correctly, the traveler is eventually faced with a second encounter. Unlike the Radiance described earlier, this presence appears only after drift has continued for a long period. The tablet gives very few details. Most of the relevant passages have been damaged. Even so, several fragments point in the same direction. Something returns. Not to punish, not to judge, but to interrupt. Until this point, the traveler has remained focused on what was left behind. Memory, attachment, observation. The second encounter seems to break that pattern. For the first time since refusing the invitation, attention is forced away from the past. The wording becomes unusually direct. Several surviving phrases suggest urgency, not fear, not violence, urgency. The opportunity that once waited patiently at the threshold does not remain open forever. At least, that is how some researchers interpret the damaged lines. The scribe never explains why. No reason is given, no mechanism is described, only the warning remains. According to the final readable sections, drift eventually reaches a limit. Beyond that limit, something changes. What that limit represents is never explained. The surviving text simply assumes it exists, not as a punishment, not as a sentence imposed from outside, but more like a consequence built into the process itself. A point beyond which hesitation becomes harder and harder to reverse. Awareness begins to narrow. Recognition becomes more difficult. The traveler grows more and more absorbed by memory itself. That may be why the second encounter matters. It arrives before that process is complete. One final interruption. One final chance to choose a different direction. The inscription never reveals what happens next. The ending is broken and the clay is damaged. The final lines are gone. All that survives is the warning and the clear impression that the decision still matters, even at the very end. For a text created thousands of years ago, that conclusion feels surprisingly modern.
Not because it proves anything, not because it answers the mystery of death, but because it places responsibility on the traveler rather than on fate. The journey is not controlled by judgment, it is shaped by attention. And according to the scribe who left these words behind, there comes a moment when attention can no longer remain divided, a moment when one final choice must be made. Unfortunately, that is also where the inscription falls silent. Buried beneath the ruins of Nippur for thousands of years, the inscription reached the modern world in a broken state. Entire sections disappeared long ago. Several of the most important passages survived only in pieces. Whatever originally filled the final lines is gone. What remains is incomplete. Even so, the surviving text continues to raise questions. Viewed through a historical lens, the tablet may be nothing more than an ancient attempt to understand death. Symbols, rituals, and stories often served that purpose in the ancient world. In that interpretation, the radiance becomes a metaphor. The choice becomes a lesson. Attachment becomes the central warning. Such conclusions are reasonable. Most historians would probably stop there. Yet another possibility remains. Someone thought this message was important enough to carve into clay. Generations preserved it. Centuries passed. Empires vanished. Languages faded. Still, the warning remained. No fragment proves what happens after death, and no inscription can solve a mystery that has followed humanity since the beginning of recorded history. All that remains is the image of a traveler standing between memory and something unknown. Beyond that point, the clay falls silent. If you enjoy thoughtful explorations of history's unanswered questions, consider subscribing and joining us for future investigations. Because somewhere beneath the myths, the ruins, and the fragments left behind by vanished civilizations, there are still mysteries waiting to be understood.